Receiving the VLS-TS felt like the end of a long and uncertain process. After gathering documents, attending appointments, waiting for a decision, and finally seeing that visa placed in the passport, it was easy to believe that the biggest administrative hurdle was now behind us. We had permission to move to France. We could make travel plans, arrange housing, and begin building our new life.
But approval of the visa wasn't the end of the process. It was only the beginning. Over the next year, we dealt with OFII, healthcare, taxes, a driver's license exchange, and the visa renewal, all with different timelines, different results, and more than $2,400 in total costs.
Once we arrived in France, the visa still had to be validated. That step was essential because the VLS-TS functions as both a long stay visa and, once validated, a residence permit for the first year. Until that validation was completed, the immigration process wasn't truly finished. And validation was only one part of a much larger administrative picture. There were also requirements connected with OFII, the French Immigration and Integration Office. There was the process of entering the French healthcare system, dealing with tax registration, determining whether and how to exchange a foreign driving license, and preparing for the eventual renewal of the right to remain in France. Each of these processes operated according to its own timeline.
Some steps needed attention immediately after arrival. Others couldn't begin until we had proof of address, a French bank account, supporting documents, or several months of residence. Some involved online applications, while others depended on letters or appointments or even responses from local offices. The result wasn't a simple sequence in which one task was completed before the next one began. Instead, the processes overlapped. While we were waiting for progress on one application, we were gathering evidence for another one. A document requested for healthcare might also be needed for taxes or immigration, and an address change could affect several files at once. Deadlines approached even while early applications remained unresolved.
Our experience took place primarily in the Hérault department in southern France. We first lived in Sète and later moved to Béziers. That matters because although many rules are national, the practical experience can vary depending on the prefecture, local offices' processing times, and the circumstances of each applicant.
We have also put together a separate checklist for these websites, the documents, the fees, and basic preparation for each of their processes. That's available through our newsletter that Liza set up. So you can save it and you can refer back to it without trying to take notes while you're watching this.
Once we arrived in France, the first thing we needed to do was validate our VLS-TS visas. We completed the process online shortly after arriving in France, and it was one of the most straightforward administrative steps. The form asked for information from our passports and visas, the date we entered France, and the address where we were staying. And we also paid the required tax of about $233 for each person. Once everything was submitted, the validation was immediate. And with that completed, the next step was for us to just wait for OFII to contact us. We were living in Lyon at the time, and we remained there for 3 months. As we prepared to leave when our time was up, we contacted OFII via email to check whether there was anything else we needed to do, but we never received a reply before our departure date. The summons, or convocation, as it's called in French, or in France, in French, arrived nearly 4 months later. It came via email while we were already in Boston visiting, and the appointment was scheduled for about 4 weeks after that in Lyon. By then, almost 4 months had passed since the visas were validated, and our travel plans, well, they'd already taken us away from the city.
Once the OFII summons arrived, we had a decision to make. The appointment was in Lyon, but by then we were no longer living there, and we had already had a Christmas market trip planned We considered trying to reschedule, but after waiting several months for the appointment, we didn't really want to risk delaying the process any further. Instead, we adjusted our Christmas trip. We shortened our time in Strasbourg, changed the train routing, and we added Lyon back into our itinerary. The train was covered by our Eurorail pass, so there was no additional long-distance transportation cost. We did need a hotel in Lyon, which would have cost us $283, but we covered that with our Capital One cashback credit. Other than that, the only additional expense was about $5 for our local transportation. The medical appointment itself is free. The convocation included a list of documents to bring, including our passports, the appointment notice, the vaccination records, and any relevant medical information that we had. There was an attached letter that mentioned a chest x-ray, but the accompanying email clarified that we didn't need to provide one. When we arrived, they checked our passports and the appointment documents. There was also an optional medical questionnaire available for us to complete. We were there applying individually. We were seen separately, and the entire appointment, by the way, is conducted in French. They reviewed our vaccination records. They asked you a few general health questions. They checked our blood pressure. They took our temperature. They listened to our breathing, and they recorded our height and our weight. There was no blood work taken, and there was definitely no chest x-ray. The entire appointment took about, 20 minutes. And at the end, we were given a stamped medical certificate confirming that we had completed the OFII medical examination and that we could keep this certificate and submit it with a visa renewal application.
With the immigration medical part complete, the next major process was entering the French healthcare system. We mailed both of our CPAM applications on the same day, and as far as we could tell, the two files were nearly identical. We had the same visa status, lived in the same household, and had the same residence history in France. We included the same major supporting documents, our birth certificates and marriage certificate with the certified translations, our French bank details, proof of private insurance, and evidence of where we had stayed in both Lyon and Sète. So we expected the applications to move through the system in roughly the same way. CPAM then asked for additional proof covering the period between our stay in Lyon and Sète. This is when we were running those Christmas markets. They wanted paid housing receipts showing where we'd been during that time. So we sent evidence of our time in Strasbourg, Paris, Nice, and Montpellier. There was one difference in all of those documents. The Paris reservation was only in Scott's name. At the time, we didn't think much of it. We were traveling together. All the other reservations supported the same timeline, and the application still showed the same household and residence history. But from that point on, the two files went in very different directions. Scott's application moved fairly quickly. His approval came about 7 weeks after we applied, followed shortly by his attestation, all set. Once the attestation arrived, we called CPAM's English-speaking line to get access to the online account. And once the account was activated, we could log in and request the carte vitale. We ended up waiting to do that in our next location, not in Sète, where Scott received the attestation. Instructions forwarding the carte vitale arrived a few weeks later, and the physical card arrived about 4 months after the original application.
I was legit then.
Yeah, so for Scott, it took roughly 8 weeks from mailing the application to receiving the confirmation of his healthcare rights, and about 4 months from the original application to having that carte vitale in hand. My application followed a different path. Instead of an approval, I received another request for information. So we submitted more clarification and additional evidence, but roughly 10 weeks after the original application, CPAM refused it. The reason given was that I hadn't demonstrated 3 uninterrupted months of residence in France.
Dude, we lived in Lyon for 3 months. Does that not count? I don't
Yeah.
understand.
So that was confusing because the two applications were based on the same travel history and almost all of the same documents, aside from my proving that I was married and my maiden name didn't match my birth certificate. That was really it. So we suspect the Paris reservation, being only in Scott's name, may have contributed to the difference, but CPAM never clearly explained that, so we can't say for certain. There was also a different person handling each file. Scott's application moved through quickly, while mine was being handled by someone named Marie. So naturally, we blame Marie.
Absolutely, we blame.
We're joking,
No.
Of course. We have no way of knowing whether the handler, the Paris reservation, or some other detail caused the different outcomes. What we do know is that two very similar applications submitted on the same day from the same household were reviewed differently and produced completely different results. By the time I received the refusal, we had days before we were moving from Sète to Béziers. So we could have continued trying to challenge the original decision, but instead, we decided it would just be simpler to start again with a clean application. This time, it would just cover a clear, uninterrupted period of residence in France that included the full 3 months we had just completed in Sète. So we rebuilt the entire application. That meant printing new copies of the documents, completing another application packet,
Yep, the whole thing.
organizing everything again, and paying for new envelopes and postage. Unfortunately, we had kept copies of the original file, which made the process so much easier than starting completely from scratch.
Yeah, note to self, that's a huge factor to keep it on digital copies all the time.
CPAM received the new application within a few days of mailing it. This time, the process moved very differently. My attestation arrived about 6 weeks later and called in the English line and got the online account and the same day. And the Carte Vitale followed roughly 3 weeks after that. And this time, there was no Marie. Apparently, that was the key. No, we're joking again.
I was going to say, it's obviously Marie's fault.
It's always Marie's fault. We still don't know exactly why the first application was refused, while the second one was accepted. I mean, whatever the reason, the second application worked, and we were pretty pleased with that. So keeping complete copies of everything turned out to be especially important because when I had to apply again, we already had the translations, the certificates, the insurance records, bank details, the evidence for the accommodation. I kept tracking those, and the previous correspondence, because we always submitted with a cover letter that we use. And we saved those in a specific file, not only on our computers, but on
our scan disk, our little thumb drive.
That made all the difference as well. It was easy to carry around and take to the post office to make copies. So a refusal doesn't always mean adding one missing document or sending a quick explanation. Sometimes it just means rebuilding the entire application and submitting it as a new file. And cross your fingers and hope it works.
The driver's license exchange started out much like the CPAM applications. We submitted both ANTS applications at the same time, shortly after we applied for CPAM, with the same expectations that they would move through the systems in roughly the same way. There's an online application, which is cool. The online application required an approved e-photo along with the usual identification and residency documents. Once everything was submitted online, there wasn't much more you could do except kind of just wait. It's a very simple kind of ANTS process. It was nearly 11 weeks before we received our first request for additional information. ANTS asked us both for our Massachusetts driver's records in English and for copies of our current licenses. The driving records were free to obtain, and we had requested them from Massachusetts RMV before we even left the United States. So we uploaded those along with our additional license copies as they requested. Later in the process, we were instructed to mail in our physical Massachusetts licenses. Once those were kind of surrendered, we no longer had the original licenses in our possession. So we were kind of relying on the French licenses to arrive and complete our exchange. For Liza, that's kind of exactly what happened. Ants received her physical Massachusetts license, validated the application a few days later, and then delivered the French license about 2 weeks after that. From the original application to the card arriving in the mail, the process took about, 4 months.
It was pretty quick.
4 months. My application followed about the same path at first. Ants received my physical license, validated the application in less than a week, about the same time. At that point, the online status showed that the process was completed, so we kind of expected my license to show up any day after Liza's did, and then nothing ever came. So a couple of weeks passed, and I used Ant's online form to ask them a question about, hey, I got a missing license. And Ants replied back really quick the following day.
We were so excited.
Yeah, like I had an email the very next day, so I was like, oh, good. And they replied saying that it was in the process of being returned to them by the post office.
And what does that mean?
So I was like, okay,
why?
what's the tracking number? But they don't have one. That was the only clear information we kind of received from them. There was no useful follow-up explaining when it was going to be returned to them, how long it was going to take, and what needed to happen next. They would only know once they receive it. The online account didn't change, and my license, or my French license, never arrived. By then, I had already surrendered my Massachusetts license, so I no longer had that card either. The unusual part was that from the Ant side, the application appeared to be finished, and the file was validated, and the online process showed no remaining actions, but the French license just would never show up.
While the healthcare and driver's license applications were still moving through the system, we also had to determine whether we needed to file French taxes. So based on the information we had, we believed we were required to file French tax returns. So because we didn't yet have normal access to their online filing system, which was a bummer, we had to prepare everything by paper returns instead, which meant working through the forms by hand and gathering copies of the supporting documents that went with them.
You're supposed to be able to get your account after you file by paper, right?
First time. You file by paper the first time, and you get everything gets set up. There was a lot of photocopying involved for us, though. Between the returns themselves, the supporting paperwork, the envelopes, the mailing costs, the total came to about $80. We mailed everything after completing the paper returns. It was a really thick packet. And exactly 4 weeks later, surprise, surprise, we received a letter from the tax office. In ink, by the way.
Yeah, they wrote it. Handwritten.
The message was pretty simple. We weren't required to submit the returns. They said no need. They're just not gonna process any of this. There was no request for additional information and nothing else we needed to do. After all the time spent preparing the forms, making the copies, organizing the documents, and paying more than $80 to mail everything, the final answer was that none of it had even been necessary.
Dude, all the research.
At least the response was clear. I didn't doubt it. I didn't feel like, oh, wait, this could be wrong. It was very, very clear. And it came pretty quickly, which is also convenient. We just had to laugh. Like this is ridiculous.
Yeah.
We'd done all this work just to make sure that we're following all the rules, only to be told that the correct next step was to do nothing at all. At the same time, everything was happening at once. The expiration date on our original visas was getting closer, which meant we also had to begin the renewal process. Our original visas were due to expire mid-July. So we submitted both of our renewal applications a little more than 3 months in advance, which is what they suggest.
You're only allowed, basically.
Yeah, you can't do it any earlier than that. And there's also, you can't do it too close to your deadline. So we prepared the two applications together and included the same supporting documents for each of us. That included copies of our passports, our current visas, information about each other for whatever reason, but they do ask. Proof of financial support, that we had enough funds, health insurance, we both had carte vitales at the time, and an approved e-photo, and evidence of our current accommodation in Béziers.
No problem.
Yeah, everything. We had it all. And at the time we applied, our accommodation documents covered the 3 months in Béziers. That was the information the ANF application asked us to provide. So that's what we submitted. The renewal e-photos cost, I like to point out how much we spent, $12 each.
You have to go to those specific e-photo booths.
To find them at the Monoprix. And once the files were complete with these e-photos and everything else, we sent both applications through the online system. I was also grateful that it was an online system instead of all the copies again. And then we waited. For almost 3 months, there was no message, no update, and no request for anything else. The applications remained in the system. They were there every time you logged in, but there was no indication that anything was missing or that we needed to take another step. But as the visa expiration date approached, the lack of communication started to matter a little more. We had plans, we want to travel, and applying early seemed to be like the safest option for us, and it still gave us more time than waiting until the last minute and being all concerned. But what we didn't know was whether submitting the applications early was even gonna do anything and get us our decisions any sooner.
Exactly 1 week before our visas were due to expire, both renewal applications had an update. We received an email directing us to log into our accounts and to check for details. We each received a request for additional documents, and prolongation certificates became available to download at the same time. Those certificates extended our legal status for roughly another 3 months, while the applications remained under review, which was pretty cool.
Yeah.
The requests were kind of similar, but not identical. I was asked for recent proof of residency and accommodations covering the entirety of our future stay. Liza was asked for the same residency documents along with her birth certificate for some reason. We could easily provide proof of where we were currently living. The more difficult part was documenting accommodation for the entire future stay for another year.
That's what they asked for. It wasn't just a month or two. They wanted the entire time of the year that you were asking this renewal visa for.
Yeah, and that wasn't how we arranged for our life in France. We were living in furnished rentals and moving from town to town for several weeks and for months. The flexibility to experience different parts of France was one of the main reasons that we chose kind of this lifestyle, and booking an accommodation for a full year ahead would have kind of changed the way that we had chosen to live at this point. So although the prolongation certificates gave us the additional time, we still had to work out how to explain and document a future stay that didn't involve one address.
At this point, we've decided not to respond to the latest ANF request. When we submitted the renewal applications, we provided the documents the system required at the time. We completed the forms, uploaded the supporting evidence, and we even applied more than 3 months before our visas expired. We could submit another explanation, type it all up, gather more documents, and we can continue trying to move the applications forward.
But we have decided not to begin another round of explanations and additional submissions. The prolongation certificates gave us the lawful status for roughly another 3 months while the applications remained open, and we are grateful to have the additional time, but it wouldn't change the decision that we've made. We're going to allow the applications to just close themselves naturally.
And this isn't because we stopped enjoying France. France itself was never the problem. We loved living here, exploring different towns and having the freedom to spend longer periods in places we might otherwise have only visited for a few days.
What changed was our understanding of how residency fit the life that we wanted to live. We proved that we could manage the administration side of living in France, and I think you did really good. I didn't do as much as I think I did. But we simply have decided that we didn't want to keep structuring our plans around the France process anymore.
For anyone considering this path to get a French visa, the main thing to understand is that the visa application is only one part of the commitment.
Yeah, the year required organization, patience, and a willingness to keep track of several separate processes, some that moved quickly, some that took months, and even two people in the same household couldn't assume that their application would be handled the same way when they got it. Keeping complete records was maybe the most important useful thing that we did. We saved digital and paper copies of the applications, the letters, the receipts, the translations, the accommodation records, and anything else that we might need to submit again. That made a real difference whenever we needed, or whenever a file needed clarification or we had to kind of rebuild the application.
Long stay residency may be a very good fit for someone who wants to settle in one place, establish a stable home, and build a long-term routine in France. Our plans were different. We wanted to move between furnished rentals and spend time in different regions and keep the flexibility that made full-time slow travel appealing to us in the first place.
Yeah, before choosing this route, it's worth looking beyond the visa itself and considering the time, the cost, organization, and the type of lifestyle that this full process might require. We'll see you next time.
We'll see you next time.